My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we're here to bring you some additional reporting on the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell, the sleazy, sordid, nasty details that kind of send shivers up your spine. We're here to report on them.
I was saying to you just before we went on air today that in reading the latest reporting from this trial, if these were consenting adults, I don't think I'd have a big problem with any of this. I mean, if people want to live their lives and do whatever they do. But the fact that these are 14-year-old girls, I'm just filled with revulsion. I don't know how else to put that.
The things that have come out here during the Maxwell trial are enough to engender rage in, I think, most any person with a conscience and a heart. The more that comes out during this trial, the more that I just have this sense of rage toward this awful woman. And as you mentioned off air, she's the only one that we can get mad at right at the moment. Jeffrey Epstein is dead, either by his own hand or some vast conspiracy. We're not sure which, but I still think he committed suicide. She's the only one left that we can get mad about. I think that makes me all the more invested in and pissed off at all of these allegations that are coming out about Ghislaine Maxwell.
I'm not big on predicting the future, but I'd be shocked if Maxwell gets off. These charges are so serious. There's so many of them. This trial only centers on 4 of the victims. There could be dozens, if not hundreds of victims, and everybody tells the same story. I know there was a serious attempt to discredit these 4 women who I have to credit with their bravery and their willingness to come forward. They were 14-year-old girls when they were first trafficked by Maxwell and Epstein. They're now women in their 40s for the most part. Mm-hmm. But I have to give them a lot of credit for being willing to step forward, some using aliases, some using only their first names. I think one of the 4 is actually using her full name.
Yes.
So tell us what happened in the trial, which is wrapping up much more quickly than originally anticipated.
Yeah, we were saying off air that this was anticipated to be 6 weeks long. At least that was certainly what was announced at the top of the trial. But instead, they have wrapped it up within a space of 2 weeks. The testimony against Maxwell lasted 12 days. They have wrapped this up much more quickly than anybody anticipated. Maybe because, as you were speculating earlier, it's because we're about to enter a long holiday break. Maybe just because they felt that it would be a better idea to wrap it up as quickly as possible. But for whatever reason, this went much more quickly than I think either of us anticipated.
I was surprised, too, that the defense only called 8 witnesses this past Thursday and Friday before resting their case. Based on the reporting that we've read, it didn't sound like they'd really put together a very strong defense of Maxwell and her behavior.
Although, according to her, on the final day of trial, when asked if she would testify in her own defense, she basically said no. No, she said, I'm not taking the stand because they haven't presented a case beyond a reasonable doubt. So she is quite confident that she's going to get off on all of this. I would imagine probably because she's rich and has gotten away with most everything her entire life.
Some of the analysis we'd read a few weeks ago, though, said that a defense attorney has to decide whether his or her client would benefit from testifying. And then remember, of course, if you testify, you open yourself up to cross-examination, which we don't think Maxwell would have ever wanted. I also think that her being this incredibly rich, successful woman who seems to have kind of wasted her life in serving Jeffrey Epstein and basically acting as a procurer, I mean, almost like a pimp. What a waste of phenomenal opportunity. Here's a woman who is affluent and well-educated and well-connected and could have done so many wonderful things, and she's trafficking in teenage girls.
Yeah.
I think that her testimony would have completely backfired, in my opinion. I think her arrogance and her sense of entitlement would have offended the jurors and made them even more likely to find her guilty.
I agree with that. I think it probably ultimately is a very good thing that she did not testify. Before we get too terribly much further, we do want to acknowledge the enormously wonderful reporting that has been done on this trial from the folks at Daily Beast. The majority of what we are citing here today comes from an article from Daily Beast reporter Kate Briquelet. I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing that name, but it is very French, and I'm not sure if I'm putting the emphasis on the right syllables, but this is just tremendous reporting, and so we thank her very much for the work that she has done, and we are going to use that as the basis for our discussion today.
We know some of the reporters for the Daily Beast, and we hope we don't get an angry message from Kate saying, "You've made hash of my beautiful last name."
I know. I'm so sorry. And you would think that because I took French, I would know how to say it, but I just have no confidence that I'm saying it right.
I'm so glad you took a shot at it, because I was looking at her byline and I thought, we should absolutely acknowledge her. And I thought, let's let Kristin do that one.
Yeah, I think it's Briquelet. That's the best I can come up with. So, Kate, I am so sorry if I've said your name wrong. It's what I got.
Outstanding reporting, and we read a variety of articles, but we thought this latest Daily Beast reporting was some of the best we'd seen.
Absolutely. So thank you very, very much for your excellent work. So at this point, we have reached the end of the Maxwell trial. It's all over, but the shouting, I think, is the actual phrase that I'm trying to use here. And the jury did begin deliberation on Monday after closing arguments, and they are looking to resume later on today. Today is Tuesday, right? I'm on winter break. I don't remember the days of the week anymore.
The day we recorded this is a Tuesday.
Okay, good to know. When teachers go on winter break, they forget all sense of time, place, date, and everything else.
Is that like brain disengagement?
It really, really is, yes.
Well, you're going to be wrapping Christmas presents before we know it, so.
That's true. We would assume. I haven't heard anything yet today. I haven't checked the news within the last hour, but I don't think the jury has come back with a verdict yet. Jurors saw a procession of witnesses from the prosecution, 24 of them in total over 10 days. 4 of those victims that you were referencing earlier are listed in that indictment against Maxwell. These were women who were, as we mentioned earlier, as young as 14 when they were trafficked and molested by Jeffrey Epstein. And several of them charged that Ghislaine Maxwell was involved with that molestation and abuse as well.
So what are some of the most important things that came out of the trial?
One of the things that really was emphasized for the jury is the fact that there was this very tight bond between Epstein and Maxwell. This wasn't just a nodding acquaintance that they had. It wasn't just business dealings. They really tried to establish that Maxwell was very deeply entwined in Epstein's life. We had used the phrase major domo, and I think that still applies. She was his girlfriend. In any attempt, I think, by people to say, oh, well, she was just a nodding acquaintance. No, she wasn't. She was his girlfriend. And so they spent a lot of time establishing she was there every step of the way, procuring these girls for him. And so they really spent a lot of time, the prosecution did, trying to lay out the fact that these two are their accomplices. And that they had this life of really almost insane luxury while they were abusing these girls. And it was not girls who came from lifestyles similar to theirs, but it was girls from financially struggling families or girls whose home life was maybe not necessarily the strongest. They also addressed the fact that Epstein imposed, the reporting referred to it as a code of silence to ensure that their employees, specifically Epstein's housekeeper, would stay silent about what they were seeing at Epstein's various residences.
They used a very disturbing expression in the Daily Beast reporting, which is they referred to Epstein and Maxwell as training these 14-year-old girls sexually. There was something about it. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. They would present these highly unusual sexually charged situations and then present those to these young girls who were very impressionable and, as you said, vulnerable. I think in previous reporting, we've seen significant detail that they seem to zero in on these young women from very vulnerable backgrounds. One girl's father had died recently. Another one confessed that her grandfather had abused her sexually when she was younger. I think they look for young people that had these areas of vulnerability that could be exploited, and then they sort of pulled them in to this world that was affluent and exciting. Several of them talked about how the then 30-something Maxwell was an exciting new friend for them to have a somewhat older woman who's clearly worldly and cultured express interest in them as people.
Exactly. We have talked a number of times with our friend and podcast colleague, Jim Clemente, and Laura Richards. Both of them are experts on the concept of sexual abuse and grooming. And grooming behavior is exactly what you saw here with Epstein and Maxwell, teaching these girls and trying to get them accustomed to the sort of abuse that they were inflicting upon them so that it seemed normal to them, so that it seemed as if this is something that, well, this is just what you do when you're rich and you're moving in these circles. This is what you're expected to do. This is how you're expected to behave, which is absolutely appalling. Like you said, it makes the hair on your back of your neck stand up. It's awful.
One of the women testified that she was molested by Epstein from the age of 14 to 18. And then at age 18, when she was actually crossing over the line of consent, more than likely in Florida, she was considered too old for Epstein. So he isn't even interested in women that are old enough to actually consent to this activity.
It's disgusting. Let's run down each of the victims. Now, we talked about Jane during some of our reporting initially about the trial. We're fairly familiar with Jane. We talked about her in a previous episode. She is testifying under a pseudonym because she is an actress who does have an acting career spanning 20 years. And so she very understandably, I think, wants to remain anonymous in this circumstance. Jane was abused by Epstein and Maxwell starting in 1994 when she was 14 years old. They began to train her, I hate that phrase, included her in group sexual encounters with other adult women. She actually named some names here of women who participated in these group activities. She gave the names Eva, Sophie, Michelle, and Emmy, Emmy being a British woman, the other, I'm assuming, American. Jane discussed the fact that she had been attending a prestigious summer camp for musicians, budding musicians, where Epstein was a donor, and he encouraged her musical talent and musical abilities and basically used that fascination that she had with music, that interest in music, to groom her in this role of becoming his, I don't even know what you would call it. I don't want to say paramour because that's too nice a term. I don't know what you would call it.
I'd go with victim. I don't think there's much else you can say. And it also appears that their financial sponsorship of things like the music school are actually designed to give them access to a steady flow of young women, girls, I have to always correct myself, so they can look for young girls to groom and pull into their orbit of these disgusting sexual exploits of these girls.
Now, I noticed that discussing Jane's testimony, Jeffrey Epstein paid for a lot of things for her. He paid for voice lessons. He paid for private school. He paid for bills that her mother couldn't afford. So I think to a certain extent with that, he is making her beholden to him. I am sure that there was at some point or another a conversation in which he basically said to her, well, I'm doing all this for you. You're going to have to do something for me. I'm almost certain that that conversation or some iteration of it happened.
Agreed.
The next victim who testified was Kate. Again, that is another pseudonym. She is a British woman, currently age 44, who said that Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell began grooming her when she was 17 years old in 1994. So again, penchant for underage women, although 17 was sort of hitting the upper limit, I think, of what Epstein would have wanted.
I've read a bit more about Kate in some previous articles, and one of the things they said about Kate was that she appeared younger. So she is kind of on the edge of the sort of girl that appeals to Epstein, but apparently she was 17 but could have passed for significantly younger.
So I was interested in the fact that her boyfriend, Kate's boyfriend, was an Oxford classmate of Ghislaine Maxwell. So the introduction was made in that way. This is my classmate, Ghislaine. Maxwell at that point invited Kate to her fashionable London townhouse a couple of weeks later for tea, again, trying to facilitate a relationship. Kate said, I was quite excited to be friends with her. I felt I had found a new connection that could be really meaningful to me.
I don't want to move too quickly past the introduction for Kate. Kate was dating a man that was probably 20 years older than she was. If he is a classmate of Ghislaine Maxwell's, she's already in that kind of orbit of being involved with a much older man and probably sexually exploited as well.
We keep seeing the term massages here through everything about this testimony. And Ghislaine Maxwell was approaching that concept with all of these girls by saying, oh, he needs massages all the time. It's very difficult to keep up with the massage schedule, I guess. Ghislaine Maxwell is making it sound like she has all this work that she has to do to keep up with it. And she's like outsourcing it to these girls.
Well, apparently Maxwell insisted on 3 erotic massages per day, which is how we end up in these exponential numbers of victims. And then, of course, he wants to see different girls all the time so that there's a massage every few hours during the course of the day, and there are victims, one after another, 3 victims per day.
Kate later testified that when she was 18, she was invited to Palm Beach, where Ghislaine Maxwell directed her to wear a schoolgirl costume.
Super creepy.
Creepy and stereotypical. She then handed Kate a tray of tea things and said, please serve him, both with the tea and then it is assumed with things afterward, the tea. Kate also testified, this quote again made me feel like I needed a shower. She asked me if I had fun and told me that I was such a good girl and that I was one of his favorites. There is a note here in the reporting from Daily Beast that says because Kate was of the age of consent in the UK, which is 17, during this pattern of abuse, jurors were instructed that she is not a victim as charged in the indictment. So the age of consent is different in the UK than the US. And so that caused a little bit of a hiccup here in proceedings.
I'm a little surprised by that because some of the sexual abuse clearly happened at Epstein's home in Florida, where the age of consent is 18. So I'm a little surprised that they were trying to apply British law to this young woman who's clearly from the UK. But I don't think all of the abuse happened on that side of the Atlantic. I'm a little baffled. We might have to ask one of our legal experts why the age of consent in the United Kingdom would have been used as opposed to the United States.
Agreed. I feel like that's a question for Francie Hakes, perhaps. The third victim then is Carolyn. That is not apparently an alias. That is a first name. No last name given. She is from Florida. She testified that she was molested by Jeffrey Epstein between the ages of 14 and 18. And this is what you mentioned earlier about the woman who said that when she turned 18, she became too old for Jeffrey Epstein.
Carolyn is the girl who had confided in Epstein and Maxwell that she'd been sexually abused when she was much younger by her grandfather and that her mother was addicted to drugs and alcohol, which created a lot of areas of vulnerability which Epstein and Maxwell were perfectly happy to exploit.
And evidently, when she turned 18, she was asked if she had any younger friends. So apparently, they were trying to get her to recruit other younger women into this perverted sex ring with Epstein and Maxwell.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. Many of you know that Othram is leading the way in DNA testing, helping law enforcement solve missing persons, homicides, and sexual assault cases across the United States and Canada using forensic-grade DNA tests.
You can help this important cause by contributing funds and your DNA profile to Othram's free site, DNAsolves.com. The process is easy and confidential. Just 2 simple steps.
Now DNA Solves has added another new feature, DNA Solves Connect, which will allow you to upload your DNA profile to help law enforcement, even if you've never used one of the commercial genealogy sites.
If you're looking for a missing family member or have lost touch with someone, DNA Solves Connect is an incredible option at only $14.95.
Upload your DNA profile to DNASolves.com.
Join Mind Over Murder as we help families find answers with Othram and DNASolves.com.
We're back here at Mind Over Murder. In some of the longer form reporting from the Miami Herald, it was reported that there was almost a circuit of young girls who would then be asked to recruit other younger girls to participate in these sex acts with Epstein and the 3 massages per day. These young girls would be paid several $100s for these quote-unquote erotic massages. They would also be paid a commission, basically, to recruit other young girls from Florida area schools to participate.
There was an absolutely infuriating comment from the defense. The gist of it was that, well, these women couldn't possibly be considered victims because they benefited financially from this. I had a couple of minutes where I couldn't even see straight when I read that. That's such an awful thing to say, and it's such a very obvious attempt at victim blaming here. It filled my head with flames and screams. It was awful.
In the documents that were created by Alexander Acosta, which were designed to limit the liability of Epstein in the sweetheart deal he was given by the then federal prosecutor, they referred to these young women as prostitutes when the truth is, under the law and under Florida law, a woman who's under the age of 18 technically can't be a prostitute because she has not even reached the age of consent. Yet they insisted on referring to these young girls as prostitutes because they were given money for their participation in these sick sex acts.
Now, Carolyn also claimed that Ghislaine Maxwell groped and abused her one particular day, which we hadn't heard up to this point. She said that she was setting up the massage table for Jeffrey Epstein. Ghislaine Maxwell came in and groped her and said, quote, "I had a great body for Mr. Epstein and his friends." So please note, this is where we bring in the "and his friends" part.
One thing that's not clear at this point is whether any of these so-called friends, which include some very well-known men, will ever be charged. There are thousands of hours of secret recordings that were made by Epstein via a hidden camera system in almost every single one of his homes. We're not clear at this point as to whether any of those men will ever be charged.
We'll get into some of those names here in a couple of minutes. The fourth victim who testified was Annie Farmer. She testified under her own name instead of an alias. She is now 42, and she testified about a weekend as a 16-year-old when Epstein and Maxwell took her on a solo trip to New Mexico. They had given her mother the impression that they would be taking her to an academic gathering for 20 to 25 students. What a shock that must have been to learn that her 16-year-old daughter was alone with this couple who were at that point in their 30s and 40s.
And she was taken to this beautiful but very isolated ranch that Epstein owned in New Mexico. Here's a young girl being sexually abused at an isolated location where there's only a handful of people there. Epstein, Maxwell, some household staff, and she has no way to escape. She's basically been kidnapped and taken to this isolated location where she spends a nightmarish weekend being sexually abused.
And Annie does give some testimony about giving Epstein his massages and about not wanting to do these things. But of course, they've paid for her to be there. And prior to this, they took her to the mall. They took her to the movies. Again, that sort of quid pro quo scenario. Well, look what we've done for you. The least you can do is this for Jeffrey Epstein. There is also reports from Annie Farmer of Ghislaine Maxwell groping and abusing her, and of Jeffrey Epstein watching during that particular process, which again makes me want to throw up in my mouth a little bit.
And then finally, Epstein's former Palm Beach butler, Juan Alessi, testified about his responsibilities to Epstein and under the direction of Ghislaine Maxwell, what he was required to do. And his descriptions of some of the things he saw were highly disturbing.
This was crazy stuff. The more that I read about this guy's testimony, the more I was like, how did you not realize what kind of a monster you were working for? He described a number of his responsibilities as being things like cleaning the massage room, rinsing off sex toys, and restocking them in Ghislaine Maxwell's bathroom closet. So apparently she has her own separate bathroom and her own closet for all of these toys. He reported that the bathroom closet also held what he described as pornographic tapes and either a black vinyl or black leather costume. I'm sure you can use your imagination on that. He also stocked Jeffrey Epstein's various vehicles with $100 bills, which is interesting because a lot of victims, including Carolyn, who testified, said that Jeffrey Epstein would pay them in cash in that denomination of $100 bills. So he was responsible for, I assume, going to the ATM, possibly pulling out hundreds and stocking his various vehicles with them.
He also testified that he saw many females lounging by the pool, topless, and that he knew for a fact that 2 of them were underage. Many of the others he thought looked young, but he didn't know how old they were, and he wasn't necessarily carding anybody as they came to the house. But he said there were many, many young females, either nude or topless, at Epstein's pool.
And this is interesting, too. He said that Ghislaine Maxwell ordered not only himself, but other household staff to follow a household manual, which ended up being 58 pages long. So clearly there's a lot here that you have to do. It's described as having a seemingly endless checklist of tasks for what to do at Epstein's mansion. Some of the things included making sure that a gun was placed in the bedside table of the master bedroom, interestingly enough. I'm going to quote directly from the article here because this is so good. I can't think of a way to phrase it any better than this. Quote, the booklet contained directives such as, remember that you see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing, except to answer a question directed at you. Asked about this rule, Alessi testified, it means a kind of warning that I was supposed to be blind, deaf, and dumb to say nothing of their lies, unquote. One of the other orders in that document was, unless instructed, never disclose Mr. Epstein's or Ms. Maxwell's activities or whereabouts to anyone. Just sick.
Alessi had worked for Epstein from 1991 to 2002, and he testified that he found the manual very degrading to him and the household staff, and that Maxwell had further added that he was never to look Epstein in the eyes when addressing him, always to be looking down or away. His hours were just ridiculous. He'd work from 5 a.m. to 9 or 10 p.m., and he described the job as, quote, slavery, unquote.
Maxwell's lawyer basically said, well, none of the female masseuses, we're talking victims here, not female masseuses. He said, well, none of them complained about being hurt or coerced. And Alessi acknowledged that. And he said, no, they never did. But I wish they would have, because I would have done something to stop it.
Hindsight 2020 and all of that.
Now we get to the point in this testimony that I'm sure a lot of people are very eager to hear about, and that is the who's who of Jeffrey Epstein, friends, famous acquaintances, you name it. Some of these, of course, are already widely known, and some of them I was a little surprised to hear until I thought about it for another minute and then realized actually I'm not surprised to hear this at all. All of these names run the gamut from politicians, actors, British royalty, businessmen, people on both sides of the aisle, left and right. It is quite a list. Some of them, of course, we are already well familiar with. Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, Prince Andrew of Britain. Some of these I was not terribly familiar with, like I was surprised but not surprised. Itzhak Perlman, violinist. Kevin Spacey, I really shouldn't have been surprised by that one, and yet.
No, not at all.
Chris Tucker, former Senator George Mitchell, former astronaut John Glenn. That one took me back. There was a question as to whether RFK Jr. took a jaunt on Epstein's plane, but the pilot did not recall if he had been there.
Other people that showed up on the plane frequently included Victoria's Secret mogul Les Wexner, who may be one of the largest sources of income for Epstein's money management business. Manhattan billionaire couple Glenn and Eva Dubin, who testified on Ghislaine Maxwell's behalf. And then Maxwell's former boyfriend, Gateway founder Ted Wyatt, was also among the people who were seen to be traveling on that plane.
They also mentioned the TV reporter Mike Wallace, now deceased. That took me a minute, too, to kind of digest that one.
Considering that Wallace was a pretty good age at that point, Jane testified that during a visit to New York City when she was 15 years old, she sang Happy Birthday to Mike Wallace at his 80th birthday.
It really, just when you think it can't get any worse in terms of people who end up embroiled in this, it gets worse. I love this next terminology by Kate. She titles this next section of her reporting, Epstein's assistants were Maxwell fangirls. And I mean, that's definitely what they come off as, for sure. Two of the witnesses that the defense called on behalf of Ghislaine Maxwell were former employees of Jeffrey Epstein. Their names are Kimberly, spelled with a C, so maybe Simberly. I think it's probably Kimberly. Espinoza and Michelle Haley. It's his quote, they shared glowing memories of Maxwell. They did acknowledge that they met Jane in the 1990s, but both testified that they believed she was an adult at the time that they met her.
She may have looked like an adult because they mentioned that she was wearing a lot of makeup. That doesn't necessarily mean she was of age.
Both of these women share such, high opinions of Ghislaine Maxwell that I just kind of have to call their credibility into question. We've got a couple of quotes from them. Quote, I highly respected Ghislaine. I looked up to her very much. You've got both of these women who keep acknowledging over and over that the girls that they saw looked like a grown-up to me, as you said, because they were wearing a lot of makeup. But they basically just said, look, Ghislaine Maxwell is fantastic. She's taught me a lot. I respect her. She's tough but great.
None of that disproves any of the prosecution's extensive testimony from these four young women. Okay,
agreed.
These people that worked for Maxwell and were well compensated by Maxwell admired her. I'm not surprised. But the fact that she was a terrific boss and tough but fair doesn't preclude the fact that she was procuring and sexually abusing all of these young girls.
Agreed. They did reveal financial records showing that Ghislaine Maxwell did receive millions of dollars from Epstein, but I do not think that is news to anyone at all. We have a whole set of numbers basically showing that Epstein wired millions and millions of dollars to accounts for Ghislaine Maxwell, including one, there was $7.35 million to an account for Air Ghislaine Inc.
What did they do with the $7.35 million?
Well, they bought a helicopter.
As one does, apparently, when one has more money than one knows what to do with.
Yeah, if I had $7.35 million, I would do a lot of things with it, but I don't think buy a helicopter is on my list.
No, nor mine.
But I don't know, the rich are different. F. Scott Fitzgerald said that. That's quote the English teacher.
I think these two can be condemned for a lot more than just being rich.
Yeah, absolutely. There is an alleged co-conspirator here by the name of Sarah Kellen, and she was named over and over in some of this testimony, but she never actually testified. And that is because when Jeffrey Epstein was given that sweetheart deal that you've mentioned a couple of times now in 2008, the document granted immunity to what they called potential co-conspirators. And there is a whole set of names here of those potential co-conspirators, of which Sarah Kellen is one. Her name continues to come up during the trial, but she did not testify. And as we said at the top of the podcast, Ghislaine Maxwell ultimately decided that she would not testify in her own defense. She proclaimed her innocence a number of times. Her statement was, quote, "Your Honor, the government has not proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt, and so there is no need for me to testify."
Okay. Not saying I buy that, not for 1 minute.
No, I don't either, honestly. I think that there's a mountain of evidence here against her. I think that ultimately she will be found guilty. If there's any sense of justice in this world, she will be found guilty. Yes, she felt no need to testify in her own defense, and that's her right. And in fact, the judge did ask her, do you understand that you can testify? Even if your attorneys don't want you to, do you understand that you can? And she basically said, yeah, I know it, but I'm not going to. So evidently she feels that the case is not strong enough, and I'm sure that she thinks that she will be found not guilty. There was mention that a number of people showed up to watch the trial, other Epstein victims. They did mention in particular Sarah Ransom, who has just published a book or is about to publish a book about her years being abused and trafficked by Epstein and Maxwell. Looking forward to reading that. They also made note of the fact that Ghislaine Maxwell had some support from her siblings, but the person probably most notably who did not show up was her husband, not husband, possibly a secret husband, Schrodinger's husband. Did not show up. Apparently, he's dating a 49-year-old yoga instructor in Manchester by the Sea where they live. So apparently it's good riddance to bad rubbish for him.
Well, it looks like Scott Borgeson has moved on then, hasn't he?
It sure looks like it. There was a little bit of a flap, as there should have been, with regard to Maxwell's lawyer accidentally, I hope you guys can hear the air quotes around that, naming some of the victims' real names in court. That's a sleazeball move. He said it was completely unintentional. I call BS on that, but whatever, maybe it was.
Especially since it happened more than once.
Yes.
Over the course of 2 weeks.
Yes. And it wasn't just for one victim, it was multiple victims. So I find that incredibly disingenuous to say, oh, it was on accident. It was not on accident, my dude. It was not. Absolutely awful. So at this point, the trial has wrapped up and we are awaiting a final verdict here. We can only hope that the jury will do the right thing and will find Ghislaine Maxwell guilty on all charges. Once we do have a verdict, y'all can count on us coming back and doing another episode in which we unpack the decision and make our own thoughts well known. Although I think at this point, it's pretty obvious where we stand on Ghislaine Maxwell.
And I still think it's a shame that Jeffrey Epstein's not here to face trial on his own.
I did like the fact that her family is apparently filing suit against the New York prison system for the conditions that she's being held in. Please, lady, give me a break.
There's a sense of entitlement, and then there's off the charts sense of entitlement.
You don't want to be treated like a prisoner, don't break the law.
True.
I realize that's a little flip, but it is what it is, honestly. That's going to do it for our coverage on the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.